I opened my front door to find a manila envelope taped to the inside of the glass. Bold letters scrawled across it read, "Open now." My first thought was that it might be from Clara, though the handwriting wasn't hers. Heart pounding, I tore it open and pulled out a single printed photo. The image was grainy but unmistakable. Clara, dressed in a sleek black dress I had never seen before, was sitting at a dimly lit bar. Her arm was draped casually over the shoulder of a man who looked at least 10 years younger than her. His hand was resting on her thigh. I felt like I'd been kicked in the chest. My first instinct was denial. It had to be a mistake, a prank, something. But as I flipped the photo over, there was more. A handwritten note, the same messy scrawl as the envelope, read, "This isn't the first time. You deserve to know the truth." That was all it said. No signature, no explanation. My head spun with questions. Who sent this? How did they know where I lived? And most importantly, what exactly did they mean by, "This isn't the first time"? I dropped the photo onto the counter and paced the room, trying to think. Clara had been acting strange for months. Aloof, secretive, coming home late with flimsy excuses about work meetings. But this was something else entirely. I tried calling her, but it went straight to voicemail. My stomach churned as I stared at the photo again, trying to make sense of it. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. My heart leapt into my throat as I yanked the door open, half expecting to see Clara. Instead, it was a delivery guy holding a small box. "Richard Cole?" he asked, glancing at his clipboard. "That's me," I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. He handed me the package and walked away without another word. The box was plain, with no return address, and lighter than I expected. I ripped it open right there in the doorway. Inside was a flash drive. No note, no explanation, just the drive. My hands shook as I plugged it into my laptop and opened the only file on it. A video. The screen lit up with shaky footage of a hotel hallway. A woman, Clara, walked into frame, holding hands with the man from the photo. They laughed as they made their way to a door. He unlocked it, and they disappeared inside. My jaw clenched as the video ended. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a fact. Clara was cheating on me. But who sent this? And why? I stared at the screen, my anger boiling over. Whoever sent the envelope and the flash drive clearly wanted me to know everything, but they also wanted me to act. I didn't know who was pulling the strings, but I wasn't going to sit back and let Clara destroy everything we built without answers. Whatever game this was, I was about to play. The next morning, I woke up to a loud knock on the door. Still groggy and filled with residual anger, I opened it to find a man I'd never seen before standing there. He was tall, sharp-dressed in a gray suit, and carrying a leather briefcase. "Mr. Cole?" he asked, his voice brisk and businesslike. "Yes. Who are you?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out a card and handed it to me. It read, "Evan Miller, attorney at law." "I'm representing your wife, Clara," he said with an air of practiced detachment. "She's requested that all communication go through me from this point forward. I have some documents for you to review." His words hit me like a sledgehammer, but I forced myself to stay calm. "She didn't have the decency to tell me this in person?" I asked, my voice low and icy. He didn't flinch. "I'm just here to deliver the documents," he replied, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick stack of papers. I took the papers and scanned the top page. Divorce papers. She wasn't just serious. She was moving at full speed. "Tell me something, Evan," I said, narrowing my eyes. "Does she know what's in this?" I held up the envelope with the damning photo, my voice dripping with contempt. For the first time, his composed mask cracked. His eyes flicked to the envelope, then back to me, a brief but noticeable hesitation in his demeanor. "What are you talking about?" he asked, trying to sound indifferent, but there was an edge to his voice now. "You're her lawyer, right? I assume she's been upfront with you about everything. Or has she conveniently left out a few details?" I leaned closer, watching him squirm. "You might want to ask her about a little hotel escapade with her boyfriend. I've got photos. I've got video." Evan shifted on his feet, and his composure faltered further. I have no knowledge of that," he stammered. "I bet you don't." I shot back, a grim smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Why don't you go ahead and confirm it with your client? But tell her this. She doesn't get to burn down my life and walk away unscathed. Before he could respond, I slammed the door in his face. My pulse was racing, my blood boiling. Clara had blindsided me, but now I had her lawyer rattled. I sat down at the dining table, staring at the stack of papers. The audacity of it all made my hands tremble. She wanted to erase me from her life and expected me to roll over and comply. Not a chance. I flipped through the documents, searching for anything that would give me an edge. That's when I saw it, a clause about financial disclosure. Clara was required to provide a full account of her assets and liabilities. An idea began to form in my mind, fueled by anger and a growing determination to expose her lies. If she thought she could steamroll me, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Detective Harris," the voice said. "It's Richard Cole," I replied. "I need your help, and I need it fast." Harris didn't miss a beat. "What's going on?" I looked at the envelope, the flash drive, and the divorce papers spread out in front of me. Let's just say my wife has been keeping secrets, and I need someone who knows how to dig. As I hung up, I felt the first spark of control returning to me. Clara thought she had me cornered, but she underestimated me. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I walked into Evan Miller's office at precisely 10 in the morning, the agreed time for our meeting. The receptionist barely looked up as she gestured toward the conference room. My pulse was steady, but inside, I was like a coiled spring, ready to explode. The room was bland. Cream walls, a polished table, and leather chairs that tried too hard to look expensive. Evan was already seated, his briefcase open, papers spread out before him. He looked up as I entered, offering a tight, forced smile. "Mr. Cole," he began, standing halfway to shake my hand. I didn't move. I stood at the edge of the table and said, calmly but firmly, "Let's not waste time. I'm the husband." That's when it happened. The man's hand froze midair, and I saw his entire demeanor shift. The confident lawyer facade cracked, and for a brief second, pure panic flashed across his face. He sat back down, his hands gripping the arms of his chair like he was bracing for impact. "So, you're the husband," he said, trying to recover. I leaned forward, meeting his gaze with a cold smile. "Yes, and judging by your reaction, I think we both know this isn't going to go the way Clara planned." I pulled out a manila folder from my bag and dropped it onto the table. "Inside here," I continued, "you'll find bank statements showing Clara transferring thousands of dollars to a man named Jake Patterson. You'll also find hotel receipts and photos of the two of them together." His face paled, the color draining from his cheeks as he stared at the folder like it was a live grenade. "Mr. Cole," he stammered, "I'm not sure where you're going with this, but—" I cut him off, my voice sharp. "Save it. Let me explain something to you, Evan. I'm not some clueless idiot Clara can manipulate. I know my rights, I know what she's done, and I know how to play this game better than she ever could." Evan's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the folder, flipping it open. His eyes scanned the documents, and I watched his jaw tighten with each page he turned. "Does she know you have these?" he asked quietly, his voice now stripped of confidence. "No," I said, leaning back in my chair, "but she'll find out soon enough." For a moment, the room was silent except for the faint rustling of papers. Then Evan closed the folder and let out a shaky breath. "Mr. Cole," he began carefully, "as her legal representative, I have to advise you that—" I interrupted again. "Spare me the lecture. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to go back to Clara and tell her this. I'm not agreeing to anything without full disclosure of her assets and liabilities. And if she tries to push this divorce through without addressing her infidelity and financial misconduct, I'll make sure the court sees every piece of evidence I have." Evan opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop him. "One more thing," I added, my voice low and measured. "Tell her this isn't just about the divorce. It's about making sure she understands she can't treat people like garbage and walk away unscathed." I stood, grabbing my bag, and started toward the door. Before leaving, I turned back to Evan, who looked like he'd just been hit by a truck. And Evan, I said, smiling coldly, you might want to reconsider your approach. You're representing someone who's about to lose everything. Don't let her take you down with her. I didn't wait for his reply. As I walked out of the building, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about exposing Clara anymore. It was about reclaiming control of my life. And this was just the beginning. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. By the time I got home that afternoon, my phone was already buzzing nonstop. 3 missed calls from Clara. A text popped up as I unlocked the screen. We need to talk. Call me. Now. I smirked, tossed the phone on the counter, and grabbed a drink from the fridge. Let her stew for a while. She was so used to pulling the strings. But now the puppet show was over. About an hour later, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Clara standing there, arms crossed, her face flushed with anger. She was dressed like she was coming from some high-powered meeting, sleek blouse, designer skirt, heels clicking against the tiles as she barged in without waiting for an invitation. We need to talk, she said sharply, spinning around to face me. I shut the door slowly, deliberately. I figured you'd show up eventually, I said, leaning casually against the wall. What's the emergency, Clara? Did your boyfriend dump you already? Her face twisted, a flicker of guilt flashing in her eyes before she masked it with indignation. I don't know what kind of sick game you're playing, Richard, but dragging my lawyer into this? Sending him those lies? That's low even for you. Lies. I shot back, my voice calm but cutting. You're going to stand there and deny it? The transfers, the hotel stays, the video, none of it's real? Do you want me to show you the evidence right now, Clara? Or would you prefer I save it for court? She faltered for a moment, but then her face hardened. You're blowing this out of proportion. Jake is just a friend. Those transfers? Loans? And the hotel? We were meeting some clients. It's not what it looks like. I laughed. Cold, bitter, and loud enough to make her flinch. Clients? That's your excuse? Do you think I'm stupid? Or do you just enjoy insulting my intelligence? Her mask slipped then, and for the first time I saw the cracks in her armor. She wasn't used to being cornered like this, and it showed. Fine, she snapped, throwing her hands up. You want the truth? Yes, I've been seeing Jake. But can you really blame me? You've been so checked out, so focused on your work, that you haven't even noticed I've been miserable for years. Miserable, I repeated, my voice rising. You mean while living in the house I paid for, spending the money I earned, and enjoying the life I built for us? That kind of miserable? Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she looked away, as if she couldn't bear to meet my gaze. You don't understand, Richard. You never did. Oh, I understand perfectly, I said, stepping closer, my voice low and controlled. I understand that you're a liar, a cheat, and a coward, and now you're trying to paint yourself as the victim because you got caught. Clara's head snapped back to me, her eyes narrowing. You think you're so righteous, she hissed. But let's not pretend you're perfect, Richard. You've made your mistakes too. Maybe I have, I said, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. But I never betrayed you. I never turned my back on the vows we made. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, filled with years of unspoken resentments and the realization that whatever we once had was gone. Finally, Clara sighed and grabbed her purse. You want to fight? Fine. But just remember, Richard, you're not the only one with a few tricks up your sleeve. She turned on her heel and marched out, slamming the door behind her. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, my hands clenched into fists. Her parting words weren't just a threat, they were a declaration of war. And if Clara wanted a war, she was about to find out what happens when you push the wrong man too far. The next day, I woke up to chaos. My phone buzzed relentlessly, one notification after another flooding the screen. Emails, missed calls, and messages, some from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Confused, I grabbed the phone and scrolled through the barrage of texts. Hey, Richard, is everything okay? Man, I just heard the rumors. What's going on with you and Clara? Saw the post. Call me if you need anything. A chill ran down my spine as I opened the next message, which contained a screenshot. My stomach dropped. It was Clara's doing, her social media account. A long post plastered with carefully curated photos of her looking distraught, accompanied by a melodramatic caption. Sometimes you realize you've been trapped in a loveless, suffocating marriage with someone who doesn't care about your happiness. I deserve better, and I'm finally standing up for myself. To those who judge me, you don't know the full story. The comment section was a circus of pity and outrage. People were eating it up, pouring sympathy all over her timeline. Friends and acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly had opinions about my personal life. I could feel my blood boiling. This wasn't just damage control. This was Clara rewriting the narrative, painting herself as the victim before I had a chance to show the truth. I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. Reacting in anger would only play into her hands. If I wanted to counter this, I had to be smart. The first step was to call Harris, the detective I'd hired. "Harris," I said when he picked up. "It's time to take things to the next level." "Good timing," he replied. "I've been working on something that you're going to want to see." An hour later, I was sitting across from him in a small, nondescript office. He placed a folder on the desk between us, a sly grin on his face. "Clara's been busy," he said, flipping open the folder to reveal stacks of documents and photographs. "I traced the bank transfers you showed me. Turns out, Jake Patterson isn't just her boyfriend. He's also been funneling money from your joint account into an offshore account. The guy's a grifter, plain and simple." I stared at the evidence, the pieces clicking into place. Clara wasn't just cheating. She was financing this guy's lifestyle with our money. Harris continued, his tone matter-of-fact. "And it gets better. I pulled some records on Jake. He's got a history of pulling scams on women like Clara. He wines and dines them, drains their accounts, and skips town when they're broke." The anger that had been simmering inside me now burned like wildfire. Clara had betrayed me, lied to me, and now she was playing the victim while being conned by a snake. "What's the next move?" I asked, my voice calm despite the storm raging within. Harris leaned back, crossing his arms. "Depends on how public you want to go. We could file a police report, press charges for fraud, and subpoena financial records to show she's complicit. It won't be pretty, though. The fallout will get messy." "Messy is fine," I said, my jaw tightening. "She declared war, Harris. I'm just making sure she understands the cost." I left Harris's office with the folder in hand, a plan forming in my mind. Clara thought she could control the narrative, but she was about to learn the hard way that lies don't hold up under scrutiny. That evening, I sat at my desk and crafted a statement of my own. Not a rant, not a smear campaign, but a cold, calculated response that laid out the facts. I attached a few key pieces of evidence, just enough to counter Clara's lies without showing my full hand. Before posting it, I hesitated for a moment, my finger hovering over the button. Then I hit publish, and the truth was out there for everyone to see. Within minutes, the notifications started pouring in. The tide was turning, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was back in control. This wasn't the end, it was just the opening salvo in a much bigger fight. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Clara had underestimated me, and now she was about to face the consequences of her actions. The fallout from my post was immediate and far-reaching. The once sympathetic comments under Clara's original post were now filled with questions, skepticism, and outright condemnation. People demanded explanations, some even calling her out for playing the victim while hiding what she'd done. My phone buzzed nonstop as friends and even acquaintances reached out, many of them shocked by the evidence I'd shared. Clara had always been good at spinning a narrative, but this time, the facts spoke louder than her carefully chosen words. The silence from Clara's side was deafening, at least until the next morning. I was in the middle of a call with Harris when another notification lit up my phone. "She's posted something else," Harris said before I could even ask. I opened her account to find a new post, this time more defensive, with a picture of her looking distraught. "To those spreading lies about me, you don't know the full story. Some people will do anything to tear others down, but I refuse to stoop to their level. I'll let the truth come out in court." It was laughable. Clara was still clinging to the hope that she could salvage her image, but the cracks were too deep now. People weren't buying it anymore. Not long after, my phone rang. It was Evan, her lawyer. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice noticeably strained. "I think we need to discuss the situation before it escalates further." "Oh, it's escalated plenty already," I replied, my tone icy. "And unless you're calling to tell me your client is ready to come clean and make this easy, we don't have much to discuss." There was a pause, then a sigh. "She's willing to negotiate," Evan said reluctantly. "Negotiate," I repeated, laughing bitterly. "She doesn't get to negotiate after what she's done. I have all the evidence I need to bury her in court. Evan, this is her chance to walk away with whatever dignity she has left." Another pause. "If we meet in person, perhaps we can come to an agreement." I thought about it for a moment. The thought of seeing Clara again after everything made my blood boil, but this could also be an opportunity to tighten the noose. "Fine," I said finally. "Set it up." 2 days later, I walked into Evan's office again. This time, Clara was already there, sitting at the conference table. She looked tired, her usual confidence replaced by something closer to desperation. She didn't look at me as I sat down across from her. Evan cleared his throat, trying to break the tension. "Let's keep this civil," he began. I cut him off immediately. "We're past civil, Evan. Let's talk about how this ends." Clara finally looked up, her eyes narrowing. "You've made your point, Richard. You've humiliated me, dragged my name through the mud." "No," I interrupted, leaning forward. "You did that to yourself. All I did was show people the truth. Don't you dare try to pin this on me." Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Evan shuffled some papers and started talking about settlements, but I barely listened. My focus was on Clara, watching her squirm under the weight of her lies. Then I dropped the bombshell. "I know about Jake's offshore account," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I know how much money you've funneled to him, and I know his history. Do you really think the court's going to look kindly on that, Clara? You've committed fraud, and I have everything I need to prove it." Her face went pale, and for the first time, I saw real fear in her eyes. "Richard," she began, her voice trembling, "you don't have to do this. We can fix this. Let's just end things quietly and move on." I shook my head. "You think this is about revenge? It's not. This is about accountability. You lied, you cheated, and you stole from me. The days of you walking away unscathed are over." Evan quickly intervened, trying to regain control of the meeting. "Perhaps we should reconvene and discuss terms." "No," I said sharply, standing up. "We're done here. Tell your client to prepare for court." As I walked out, I didn't feel anger anymore, just resolve. Clara had wanted a fight, and now she had one. But this time, I wasn't going to lose. The courtroom was packed when the hearing began. Clara sat at the defendant's table next to Evan, her face pale but defiant. I could see the cracks in her usual composure. A nervous glance here, a tight grip on her pen there. She knew this wasn't going to end well, but her pride wouldn't let her show weakness. I sat across from her, my lawyer, Sarah, at my side. Sarah was sharp, relentless, and exactly the kind of ally I needed. She had meticulously prepared for this moment, and it showed in her confident demeanor. The judge called the session to order, and the proceedings began. Evan was the first to speak, trying his best to downplay Clara's actions as irreconcilable differences, and shift the focus to our mutual incompatibility. It was the kind of generic legal jargon designed to soften the blow, but Sarah wasn't having it. When it was her turn, she stood and calmly laid out the case. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice firm but professional. "This is not a case of irreconcilable differences. This is a case of betrayal, financial misconduct, and deceit. My client has provided substantial evidence proving that Mrs. Cole engaged in an extramarital affair, misappropriated joint funds, and attempted to manipulate these proceedings to her advantage." She walked to the evidence table, holding up the folder Harris had prepared. "These bank statements show Mrs. Cole transferring tens of thousands of dollars to Mr. Jake Patterson, a known fraudster with a documented history of exploiting women for financial gain. These funds were taken from accounts jointly held by Mr. and Mrs. Cole without my client's consent." Evan objected, claiming the transfers were loans. But Sarah was ready. She pulled out screenshots of Jake's offshore account, along with records linking the transactions directly to Clara. "And if that weren't enough," Sarah continued, her voice rising slightly, We have photographic and video evidence of Mrs. Cole engaging in behavior that clearly demonstrates the nature of her relationship with Mr. Patterson. This is not about loans, Your Honor. This is about deliberate deception and misuse of marital assets. Clara shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her expression growing more strained with each passing second. The judge turned to Evan. Do you have a response to these claims? Evan stood, visibly flustered. Your Honor, while we acknowledge that mistakes may have been made, these allegations are being exaggerated. Mrs. Cole was under emotional distress and made decisions that, while regrettable, were not malicious. Regrettable decisions? Sarah shot back, her tone incredulous. Misappropriating marital funds and engaging in an affair are not simply regrettable. They are deliberate actions that have caused significant harm to my client. The judge raised a hand to silence them and turned to me. Mr. Cole, would you like to speak? I stood, my eyes locking with Clara's as I began. Your Honor, I've spent years supporting Clara. Financially, emotionally, in every way a husband should. I worked hard to build a life for us, and I trusted her completely. That trust was shattered when I discovered the truth. Not only was she unfaithful, but she used our joint resources to fund her affair. This isn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It's a betrayal of every promise she ever made to me. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but the judge cut her off with a sharp look. Mrs. Cole, the judge said, do you have anything to say in your defense? Clara hesitated, her hands gripping the edge of the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaky but defiant. Your Honor, I made mistakes, but Richard wasn't perfect either. He was distant, always buried in his work. I felt invisible, and Jake, he made me feel seen. I didn't mean for things to go this far. Her attempt at justification was met with silence. Even Evan looked uncomfortable as she spoke. The judge sighed and leaned forward. Mrs. Cole, feeling neglected does not excuse theft or deceit. The evidence against you is substantial, and it paints a clear picture of deliberate wrongdoing. The hearing ended with the judge calling for a recess. As I walked out of the courtroom, Clara's eyes burned into my back. She wasn't defeated yet, her pride wouldn't allow it. But the weight of her actions was finally starting to catch up with her. And I was just getting started. The fight wasn't over, but I could see the cracks in her armor. She had underestimated me, and now she was watching her carefully constructed world fall apart. The aftermath of the court session unfolded like a storm. Clara's silence wasn't one of retreat. It was the eerie calm before her next move. I knew her well enough to understand that when she felt cornered, she'd lash out. What I didn't expect was how far she'd go. 2 days later, I got a call from Harris. Richard, he said, his tone more serious than usual. We've got a situation. You need to see this. Harris forwarded me a video link. It was a recording from a local news outlet. My stomach churned as I hit play. There was Clara, standing outside a courthouse, tears streaming down her face as she spoke to a reporter. I'm just trying to move on and rebuild my life, she said, her voice trembling. But my husband is dragging me through the mud. He's weaponizing our personal issues to destroy me, and now I'm receiving threats because of his lies. I'm afraid for my safety. I clenched my fists so tightly my knuckles turned white. She wasn't just doubling down. She was painting me as some vindictive monster while weaponizing public sympathy. The comments on the video were a mixed bag, with some people sympathizing and others questioning her story. But one thing was clear: Clara wasn't done fighting. Harris called again later that evening. I've been keeping tabs on Jake Patterson, he said. You'll want to hear this. What now? I asked, already bracing for the worst. Jake skipped town, Harris said. Word is, he caught wind of the court hearing and decided to bail before things got too hot. But before he left, he cashed out most of the offshore account Clara was funneling money into. She's broke, Richard. She doesn't know it yet, but her golden boy just burned her. The irony of it hit me like a freight train. Clara had betrayed me for a conman, and now he'd done to her exactly what she helped him do to me. But instead of feeling satisfaction, I felt something else, an opportunity. Can we prove it? I asked. Absolutely, Harris replied. We've got the transaction records. It's airtight. The next day, Sarah and I sat in her office, going over our next move. We need to make this public, I said. Clara's trying to control the narrative, but if we expose what Jake did, her whole house of cards collapses. Sarah nodded, already typing away on her laptop. We'll need to release this strategically. Let the evidence do the talking. No emotion, no drama, just cold, hard facts. By the end of the day, we had everything ready. Sarah reached out to a trusted journalist who specialized in investigative reporting, and within hours, the story was live. The headline read, "Local woman's affair with conman ends in financial ruin. Exclusive evidence unveiled." The article detailed Clara's transfers to Jake, his history of scams, and his recent disappearance with the funds. Screenshots of the bank records and offshore accounts were included, leaving no room for doubt. The fallout was immediate. Social media exploded with reactions. People who had initially supported Clara began turning on her, accusing her of deceit and poor judgment. The same friends who had rallied behind her after her courthouse stunt now called her out for her lies. That evening, my phone rang again. It was Clara. For the first time in weeks, she sounded genuinely panicked. "Richard, we need to talk," she said, her voice shaking. "Oh, now you want to talk?" I replied coldly. "What happened to only communicate through my lawyer?" "Please," she begged. "I didn't know Jake was going to do this. I need help." I let out a bitter laugh. "Help? You're kidding, right? After everything you've done, you expect me to bail you out?" "Richard," she said, her voice rising in desperation. "If you don't help me, I'll lose everything." "You already have," I said firmly, "and you brought it on yourself." Before she could respond, I hung up. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Clara's lies had finally caught up with her, and I didn't need to lift a finger. Her own choices had done all the work for me. A few days after Clara's desperate call, I received a notification from my lawyer, Sarah. The court had set a final date for the divorce proceedings. It was clear now that Clara's strategy of smearing me publicly had backfired spectacularly. The news story about Jake's con had turned the tide completely, leaving her isolated and scrambling. When the day came, I walked into the courtroom feeling calm, even confident. Clara, on the other hand, looked like a shadow of the woman I used to know. Her once impeccable appearance was frayed, dark circles under her eyes, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with a pen. The hearing was swift. The judge, already aware of the evidence we'd submitted, wasted no time cutting through the noise. Clara's attempts to defend her actions were weak and unconvincing, her voice faltering as she tried to justify the bank transfers and her affair. "Mrs. Cole," the judge said sternly, "your behavior not only violated the trust inherent in your marriage, but also involved financial misconduct that cannot be overlooked. Given the evidence presented, this court finds in favor of Mr. Cole." The gavel struck, and just like that, it was over. The judge granted me the larger share of our marital assets and ordered Clara to pay restitution for the funds she had misappropriated. Clara's face crumpled as the reality of her situation hit her. But the real blow came after the hearing. As I was gathering my things, Evan approached me. He looked exhausted, his earlier smugness completely gone. "Mr. Cole," he began cautiously. "Off the record, I have to say, I didn't know the full extent of what Clara had done when I took this case. If I had," I cut him off, raising a hand. "It doesn't matter now, Evan. Just make sure your next client doesn't drag you down with them." He nodded, looking relieved as he turned to leave. As I walked out of the courtroom, Clara was waiting by the steps, her arms crossed. She looked up as I approached, her expression a mixture of anger and desperation. "Are you happy now?" she snapped. "You've ruined me, Richard. Was that your plan all along?" I stopped in front of her, my face calm but resolute. "No, Clara. My plan was to protect myself and expose the truth. You ruined yourself when you lied, cheated, and thought you could walk away without consequences." She opened her mouth to retort but stopped, her shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of her. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something I hadn't seen in years: regret. "I didn't mean for it to end like this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "But it did," I replied, my tone firm but not unkind. "And now we both have to live with the choices we made." Without another word, I walked past her, feeling the weight of the past months lift with each step. For the first time in years, I felt free. Not just from Clara but from the anger and betrayal that had consumed me. As I reached the bottom of the steps, I saw Sarah waiting by her car. She smiled as I approached, her expression warm and triumphant. "It's over," she said simply. "No," I replied, looking up at the clear blue sky. "It's just beginning." With that, I got into my car and drove away, ready to rebuild my life, this time on my own terms. The days following the final court hearing were a whirlwind of emotions. Relief, vindication, and a strange sense of emptiness all mingled together. For so long, my life had revolved around Clara's betrayal and the fight to expose the truth. Now that it was over, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into the unknown. But the peace that came with her absence was undeniable. No more manipulative phone calls, no more public stunts to smear my name. Clara had disappeared into the shadows, her reputation in tatters and her financial situation worse than ever. Jake's betrayal had left her completely exposed, and the people who once rallied behind her now avoided her like the plague. One morning, as I sipped coffee in my now quiet and empty home, I received an unexpected email. It was from Clara. The subject line read simply, "Closure." Against my better judgment, I opened it. The message was long, rambling, and full of apologies that felt half-hearted at best. She claimed she never intended to hurt me, that she got caught up in her own unhappiness and made terrible decisions. She blamed Jake for manipulating her, painting herself as another one of his victims. But there was no accountability, no genuine acknowledgement of what she'd done to me. It was just another attempt to rewrite the narrative in her favor. I didn't reply. I didn't see the point. Clara's words didn't matter anymore. She had been reduced to a chapter in my life. A painful one, yes, but one that was finally closed. Instead, I focused on moving forward. I threw myself into my work, which had been a lifeline through the chaos. My colleagues had been supportive throughout the ordeal, and returning to the projects I loved felt like rediscovering a part of myself I'd lost. I even began reaching out to old friends, people I'd unintentionally distanced myself from during my marriage. One evening, I met up with Harris to thank him for his work. We sat at a quiet bar, the kind of place where you could have a real conversation without shouting over the music. "You did good, Harris," I said, raising my glass. "I couldn't have done it without you." He shrugged, smirking. "You gave me a hell of a case to work on." Honestly, watching Clara's lies crumble in that courtroom was worth it. We laughed, but as the conversation went on, he leaned in and gave me a serious look. "So what's next for you, Richard? What do you want now that this is all behind you?" It was a question I hadn't fully considered. For months, my focus had been on survival, on fighting back and protecting what was mine. Now, with that battle over, I had the chance to start fresh. "I want to rebuild," I said after a pause. "Not just my life, but myself. Clara took a lot from me, but she didn't break me. I'm still standing, and I'm not going to waste this second chance." Harris nodded, lifting his glass. "To second chances, then." We clinked glasses, and in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Clara may have tried to destroy me, but in the process, she taught me something invaluable. I wasn't just a survivor. I was stronger than I ever realized. And with that strength, I was ready to step into the next chapter of my life, leaving her and all the chaos she brought far behind me. A month after the final hearing, life had begun to settle into a rhythm again. I'd moved forward with confidence, cutting ties with anything that reminded me of Clara. The house, the memories, even the furniture, gone. I wanted no remnants of her betrayal clinging to my future. One morning, I received an email from Sarah. It wasn't about the divorce. That chapter was truly closed. Instead, it was an offer to meet for coffee, an informal invitation that caught me off guard. Sarah had been nothing but professional throughout the ordeal, and I hadn't considered the possibility of connecting beyond our working relationship. Curious, I agreed. We met at a quiet cafe downtown. She arrived in her usual composed way, but there was something lighter about her demeanor, a warmth I hadn't noticed before. "I wanted to check in," she said as we sat down. "You've been through a lot, and I just wanted to see how you're doing now that it's all over." I smiled. The courtroom was packed when the hearing began. Clara sat at the defendant's table next to Evan, her face pale but defiant. I could see the cracks in her usual composure. A nervous glance here, a tight grip on her pen there. She knew this wasn't going to end well, but her pride wouldn't let her show weakness. I sat across from her, my lawyer, Sarah, at my side. Sarah was sharp, relentless, and exactly the kind of ally I needed. She had meticulously prepared for this moment, and it showed in her confident demeanor. The judge called the session to order, and the proceedings began. Evan was the first to speak, trying his best to downplay Clara's actions as irreconcilable differences and shift the focus to our mutual incompatibility. It was the kind of generic legal jargon designed to soften the blow, but Sarah wasn't having it. When it was her turn, she stood and calmly laid out the case. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice firm but professional. "This is not a case of irreconcilable differences. This is a case of betrayal, financial misconduct, and deceit. My client has provided substantial evidence proving that Mrs. Cole engaged in an extramarital affair, misappropriated joint funds, and attempted to manipulate these proceedings to her advantage." She walked to the evidence table, holding up the folder Harris had prepared. "These bank statements show Mrs. Cole transferring tens of thousands of dollars to Mr. Jake Patterson, a known fraudster with a documented history of exploiting women for financial gain. These funds were taken from accounts jointly held by Mr. and Mrs. Cole without my client's consent." Evan objected, claiming the transfers were loans,